Welcome back to Pokemon Episode Summaries. Today, I'll be doing another special episode of the anime, being another episode of Pokemon Chronicles, titled Putting the Air Back in Aerodactyl. This episode actually focuses on Oak, Tracy, and Gary. Anyways, the episode begins on a bright morning on the Pallet Town beach. Yeah, that's right. Apparently Pallet Town had a beach. And Professor Oak was by the beach docks, taking a little vacation, a little break from his lab duties. And he was currently shopping at the stands for some presents and souvenirs and shit for Ash's mom. Yeah, they're totally fucking... anyways, as Oak observed the many stands throughout the docks, he eventually came across a dark chocolate Chansey and a Lickitung filled with cream. Yeah, I'm not making this shit up. And he was going to choose between those two to give as a present to Ash's mom, when Tracy, who was doing some observation on the water, looking for a good wave to sketch or some shit, called Oak over to get Oak's attention. Tracy was standing at the edge of the dock, the pier, so Oak met him there, bringing two huge suitcases with him, as Tracy comments that the boat to the island that they were going to, Seda Island, was almost there, at the pier. Tracy then takes notice that Professor Oak had brought a lot of stuff, stating that 2 whole suitcases seemed like a lot for when they were only going to be spending 2 days on Seda Island, although Professor Oak countered that a lot of it was presents for his grandson, Gary. Yeah, that's right, he only really bought 1 souvenir for Ash's mom, the rest were for Gary. Why did Professor Oak pack so many souvenirs for Gary and buy so many things for Gary, you may ask? Well, it was because Gary was studying shit at the island that they were going to because of his new career as a Pokemon researcher, and Oak and Tracy had gotten an invitation from Gary because he said that he needed their help with something, and he further detailed in his message to them that he had found something, and he wanted Oak and Tracy to come to the island to see it, stating that they had to see it, which really intrigued them because they wondered what was so cool that they had to see. Tracy was worried that whatever Gary saw would be underwhelming as hell, but Oak was just excited to go to the island anyway to see Gary. Oak then teased Tracy about how he didn't even know or remember Gary earlier until Oak explained to him that he was his grandson and an ex-rival of Ash, used to be a Pokemon trainer, but then decided to be a Pokemon researcher. How did Tracy forget Gary, you may ask? I don't know. Let's just say he got too enveloped in his sketches or some shit. It's Tracy. There's a reason why he was written off the main cast. Anyways, soon enough, while Oak and Tracy were talking, they saw the boat approach in the distance. The boat that was supposed to take them to the island arrived at the pier, being driven by a man who seemed to recognize Oak and Tracy, and he introduced himself as Jared, assuring them that he would be the pilot of the boat that would take them to the island. Though, first, Jared confirmed Professor Oak's and Tracy's identities to make sure they were the people he was looking for, and Jared also confirms that he was a research and development assistant at the Seda lab on Seda Island, so that's how he knew how to get there. Without further ado, Tracy and Oak hop in Jared's boat as they drive off to the island, but unbeknownst to them, they were being watched by Cassidy and Butch, who were on the dock spying on them, having been sent to Pallet Town by Dr. Namba, who gave them further instructions to go to the island as well. As Dr. Namba had somehow heard that Tracy and Oak were going to the island, so he figured that there would definitely be something worth stealing there, so that's why he sent Butch and Cassidy, and Butch and Cassidy declared that they were going to follow Oak, Tracy, and Jared, calling them all fools, doing this job so that they could make money, as Dr. Namba had promised them a reward if they were able to find whatever rare thing that Oak, Tracy, and Jared were going to the island for. Anyways, on the boat, as they were heading to the island, Jared told Professor Oak and Tracy that Gary would have come to pick them up himself, but he was finishing the project that he was working on that he wanted Tracy and Oak to check out as they were currently driving to the island. Oak asked Jared what kind of project it was, although Jared didn't tell him, saying that it'd be better if Oak saw it in person. Just then, a school of seeking jumps out of the water, which Tracy spots, and he becomes excited as he had never sketched seeking before. So he begins to sketch, using his trusty sketch pad and pencil. As Tracy finished an actual remarkable drawing of the seeking, as you can see here, Professor Oak remembered having a seeking when he was younger and used to be a trainer. He was never like a battler or anything, but he did used to raise some Pokemon of his own. And Oak added that the reason why he caught the seeking was because he saw it heading upstream against the current near Vermilion City, and he felt that he could relate to it, since he was also swimming against the current in a way, and trying to improve himself. Oak continues to go on about how fucking incredible seeking were, although Tracy was bored by Oak's talking, so he simply just directed his attention to the water, trying to look at some more water Pokemon to sketch as well, as Jared told Professor Oak that seeking weren't half as incredible as what they were about to see when they arrived on the island. Just then, Oak, Tracy, and Jared see Seda Island in the distance, and it gets clearer and clearer and clearer as the boat soon docks on the island, and they all get out of the boat and go on the island's beach, as Jared tells Professor Oak that he won't believe what his grandson had been working on, and they begin walking along a beach path toward the laboratory on the island until they were startled, hearing a strange creepy noise in the distance. They get scared, as it felt like pits were dropping in their stomach, when suddenly they found out that they had a reason to be scared, as an Aerodactyl appeared in front of them, roaring immensely loud. Thinking fast, Jared, Oak, and Tracy drop down to the ground and curl up into balls to avoid the Aerodactyl as it flew overhead. Of course, Oak was shocked to see the Aerodactyl, since it was a known fact that they were currently extinct. Thankfully, as Oak was thinking about this, the Aerodactyl flew over the 3 of them, leaving them still alive. Just then, it was revealed that Gary and a head researcher at the laboratory named Dora had heard the Aerodactyl and saw it fly over, and they called for it to come back. As they run after it, though, they of course run into Jared, Oak, and Tracy, and this leads Gary to completely forget about the Aerodactyl and greet Professor Oak and Tracy. And Dora greets them as well, introducing herself, and Gary and Dora help the 3 of them up. Oak found it a bit odd when Tracy greeted him, though, as he referred to him as Professor Oak and not Grandpa. Although Oak quickly shrugged this off, coming to the conclusion that Gary probably just wanted to be more professional around another head researcher, and turned his attention to the Aerodactyl, asking about it. Although Gary doesn't give Oak a straight answer, telling him that he would explain the Aerodactyl when they got to the lab, stating that Aerodactyl was part of the reason why he needed Oak's help. So, without further ado, Gary and Dora take Oak, Tracy, and Jared to the lab. It turns out that Butch and Cassidy had actually took a boat to the island as well, and they soon arrived at the beach, having overheard Gary mention an Aerodactyl right as he left to the lab with the others. So they declared that they were going to search for the Aerodactyl, realizing that that was likely the rare thing that Dr. Nambo wanted them to find. So they jumped out of their boat and headed for the research lab, thinking of a plan on the way. Anyways, Gary, Dora, Oak, Tracy, and Jared arrived at the research lab, and before getting to what Gary needed help with, Gary and Dora gave Oak, Tracy, and Jared a tour through the lab first, starting with the museum display, which was actually open to the public if any tourists happened to come. Anyways, in this museum display, there was replicas of prehistoric Kanto Pokemon like Omanyte, Omastar, Kabuto, Kabutops, and Aerodactyl. Gary then explains that the replicas were just that, replicas, and the real Omanyte, Omastar, Kabuto, Kabutops, and Aerodactyl were living as fossils. Since even though they were extinct, their DNA could still be studied as if they were alive through the fossils they left behind. Admitting that that's what the research lab primarily studied, being fossils from prehistoric Pokemon, such as the old Amber that Gary acquired on his journey. Oak asked if that was the only fossil Gary was researching, leading Dora to butt in and deny, explaining that they were also researching a fossilized Aerodactyl egg, and added that she had been researching it before Gary even arrived to the lab. Oak cuts Gary off, bringing up how Gary still hadn't given him an explanation for the Aerodactyl attack, and just the fact that Aerodactyl was alive in general, leading Gary to state to his desperate grandfather that really wanted an explanation, that Aerodactyl coming back was related to the fossilized Aerodactyl egg and the old Amber, explaining that Aerodactyl was actually related to the main top secret area of research the lab was working on, which was the revival of ancient Pokemon by transforming the fossils into eggs. Basically, Gary explained that while looking to turn the old Amber and the Aerodactyl, the fossilized Aerodactyl egg, into eggs, they analyzed both the old Amber and the fossilized Aerodactyl egg and saw that the DNA matched. They both came from an Aerodactyl. So they came to the conclusion that with these two items combined, they could combine them somehow to bring an Aerodactyl back to life. Oak was shocked by this, realizing that the Aerodactyl was there because it had been revived by Gary, and he was about to congratulate Gary on actually being able to revive an extinct Pokemon, regardless of how scary it was. But Gary told his grandfather that congratulations weren't in order, since Aerodactyl being revived actually was the problem that Gary had called Oak and Tracy for help for. Gary then cursed himself, stating he shouldn't have revived Aerodactyl in the first place. Tracy and Oak were a bit confused as to why Gary was in such a bad mood, leading Gary and Dora to take Oak and Tracy to the top secret lab that Aerodactyl was revived in. And much to Oak and Tracy's surprise, they found that every piece of equipment and just the general layout of the room was totally wrecked, smashed, and taken apart. Of course, Gary and Dora were not shocked whatsoever, as they had experienced the destruction of the lab firsthand, explaining that, as we see a flashback of this happen, that they were testing the cloning method on the old Amber of Aerodactyl, so they could essentially replicate its DNA and put it in the fossilized egg to basically create an Aerodactyl, but added that this went extremely wrong, because for some reason, the Aerodactyl DNA was put into the egg, but it hatched a bit prematurely for a reason that Gary and Dora couldn't figure out, and then it escaped from the machine that the old Amber was placed in, and it was extremely angry immediately upon being revived, and destroyed the entire lab, starting with the machine that it escaped from, and then it left the lab, and that made Tracy and Oak realize why Gary and Dora were chasing after the Aerodactyl. Oak and Tracy stated how unfortunate it was that all their lab equipment was destroyed, but Gary stated that that was the least of his and Dora's worries, because as professional researchers, they always had spare machines and shit, so they were just in the process of getting them hooked up. The thing that was actually concerning them was stopping Aerodactyl from going on a rampage and finding out why it was angry and desperate to hatch early. Also adding that this was difficult, since even if they did find Aerodactyl, they couldn't harm it either. At least severely, because they thought that that would be inhumane. Just then, a little girl entered the room, which happened to be Dora's sister, Crystal, and she was apparently a Pokemon expert, even though she didn't actually own any Pokemon of her own, and immediately recognized Professor Oak. Although she comments that Professor Oak looked older in person than on magazines or TV. And then Crystal mentions that she was the one who actually found the fossil egg, not Dora, and this annoys Dora, who demands that Crystal get back in her room, introducing Crystal to the rest of them as her little sister. Although Crystal stated that she had heard everything that had just went on, that Gary had just said, and declared that she wanted to help locate the Aerodactyl. Dora was hesitant to let her little sister help, but Oak, on the other hand, said they would need as much help as they could get, since they had to find Aerodactyl immediately and bring it back to the lab, because otherwise it could become extra dangerous as if it ended up crossing the ocean across the island, because then it could go to any place in the world it wanted and attack anyone. Crystal then stated that she could help by summoning her friends. Gary and Oak and Tracy questioned what Crystal meant by this, leading Crystal to explain that despite how young she was, she had a talent of knowing how to act around wild Pokemon and earn their affection, which made her able to control them as if they were her own Pokemon. Oak doubted Crystal, not believing that a young kid could have an ability like this, so they asked her to demonstrate. Dora was skeptical, just wanting to send Crystal to her room, but Oak said that it was worth a try to see if Crystal was telling the truth. So, Crystal leads Oak, Gary, and Tracy, and Dora to a reefside cliff, where Crystal proceeded to whistle extremely loudly, and, sure enough, a pack of Lapras arrived, impressing Professor Oak. The entire pack then surfaced one by one and swam close to her, and Oak got even more impressed as the Lapras obliged, as Crystal ordered all the Lapras to search the sea and try and spot Aerodactyl. And Oak commented that Crystal was right. It was almost as if she owned them. Although Crystal stated that this was just the beginning of her Pokemon calling abilities, and declared that she was going to show off some more of the abilities, as she whistled a slightly different pitch to summon a pack of Farfetch this time. And just like with the Lapras, they obey her command to fly up and search the sky for Aerodactyl. Tracy asked Crystal if she could summon some Pidgey as well, but Crystal stated that there was no Pidgey on the island. An extremely impressed Professor Oak told Crystal that he now believed her. She could call Pokemon that she didn't even own, and stated that she would make an excellent Pokemon trainer one day. Meanwhile, as for Butch and Cassidy, they were up in a tree in the middle of the woods on the island, and they were searching around the area, trying to find Aerodactyl by looking through some binoculars, particularly focusing on the research lab, assuming that Aerodactyl may have been inside the lab. And they proceeded to plan their next move about what they would do to break into the lab, but much to their shock, as they were planning, finally being able to concentrate and come up with an idea, Aerodactyl flew near them and stared at them for a few seconds. This startled Butch and Cassidy, but they barely had any time to react anyways, as the Aerodactyl then used Gust to blow them off of the tree, and as a result, Butch and Cassidy go falling down into the bushes below. The Aerodactyl then flies off, much to the disappointment of Butch and Cassidy, when they finally recover from their startled state and realize that Aerodactyl was gone, and they also realize that Aerodactyl had just encountered them, period, as they didn't even fully realize before, since they were so frozen with shock. But now that they knew for a fact that Aerodactyl was close, they just became even more determined to catch it, knowing that they could eventually catch up. And they proceeded to fantasize, as they tried to catch up, about how much money they would get for giving Dr. Namba a Pokemon that was said to be long extinct. Butch and Cassidy then get up and realize that they would need a huge-ass net to capture the Aerodactyl, a bigger one than Dr. Namba had supplied them with, so they got to work on constructing a bigger net themselves, with some spare materials that they happened to have. Don't question how they had them. Meanwhile, while Dora had stayed at the research lab to do some work with setting up the new equipment, Tracy, Oak, and Gary were searching out in the woods, calling for Aerodactyl, walking along a path. Suddenly, though, Gary stops while walking along the path, stating that he was too tired, and remarked that he thought that it was hopeless, they would never find Aerodactyl. However, Oak told Gary that they had to find Aerodactyl no matter what, since he wanted to learn more about it, and he was sure Gary wanted to learn more about it as well, and also reminded him of the dangers that Aerodactyl could cause if they didn't find it. Gary was still down, though, still claiming he was too tired, leading Oak to suspect that there was something else going on, and a reason other than what Gary had said as to why he was feeling down, leading Gary to admit that he felt that he should never have become a researcher, and he wasn't a proper one by any means, stating that if he was a proper researcher, then Aerodactyl wouldn't be on the loose. And Gary complained that all he had done as a quote-unquote researcher was try and be the best researcher and make Professor Oak proud, but he was so focused on that he actually didn't even accomplish anything as a researcher anyways, and he just let Aerodactyl get away. But Tracy and Oak comforted Gary by reminding him that he had accomplished something as a researcher, being able to fucking revive an Aerodactyl. Gary replied that that wasn't really an accomplishment for him, since he just fucking revived Aerodactyl by accident. He didn't even know what he was doing, and he also proceeded to blame himself for reviving it at all, stating that he should have realized the potential consequences of Aerodactyl getting loose. Although Oak replied that everyone made mistakes and had to learn from them, even the best researchers, and Tracy added that Ash wouldn't get so discouraged because of one mistake, stating that he would never give up and would always prepare himself for the worst case scenario and go through with the worst case scenario if it was necessary. Gary, now being reminded of Ash, asked how he was doing, curious, leading Oak to reveal, asking if Oak or Tracy had heard from him, that he had heard from Ash and knew that he had already collected several gym badges in Hoenn and was on his way to the Hoenn League, doing very well. Tracy then added that Ash was training very hard for the Hoenn League with new Hoenn Pokemon that he had caught, with Tracy adding that he was anxious to hear Ash's next update call, since he knew that Ash had likely caught even more new Pokemon than what he had heard about last time, and he wanted to meet all of Ash's new Pokemon in person. Gary was impressed and glad to see that Ash was doing so well in Hoenn, and proceeded to remember their past as rivals and how they were always at each other's throats, and admitted that he kind of missed that, and he missed being a trainer, and thought that maybe he should give up being a researcher after all, and go back to his training escapades. However, Oak stated that that would be a bad idea for Gary, assuring him that he made an excellent choice to become a researcher, and he was very proud of him, stating that his journey as a researcher was just beginning, so he shouldn't give up on it, with Tracy adding that learning was more important than the destination, basically telling Gary that he didn't have to be a good researcher right away, and if he thought it was his calling, then he should just become a better researcher as he went on. Gary was now motivated, promising to continue being a researcher, as one of the Farfetch that Crystal had summoned swooped down to Oak, Gary, and Tracy, and motioned that it had found something. Meanwhile, Dora had finished her business in the lab, and went to go join Jared and Crystal, who were already searching in another direction in the forest for Aerodactyl, when suddenly, another one of the Farfetch that Crystal had summoned came up to them as well, and motioned that it had found the same thing that the other Farfetch found. Gary, Oak, and Tracy follow the Farfetch that came to them, while Dora, Crystal, and Jared follow the one that came to them, and both the Farfetch meet up, causing the two groups to meet up as well, on a mountain, the island's highest point. Apparently, according to Crystal, who was able to somewhat understand what the Farfetch was saying by their movements, the Farfetch had spotted Aerodactyl at the top of this mountain taking a nap, and as Crystal searched the mountain, she declared that Aerodactyl was still there taking a nap. Although she called Aerodactyl the fossilized egg, since that's what she knew it as, since she had found the egg. Soon enough, everyone followed Crystal, and they eventually arrived behind a rock where they saw Aerodactyl sleeping in front of it. So they quietly tried to sneak up on it, planning what they were going to do to catch it as they creeped closer, although they were having trouble coming up with an idea, and to make matters worse, Crystal suddenly tripped by mistake, which disturbs the Aerodactyl, waking it up as it goes to fly off in anger, not wanting its sleep to be disturbed anymore. However, Tracy, desperate to not let Aerodactyl get away, climbs up onto a high rock and grabs onto Aerodactyl's leg as it flies away, causing them to both go flying in the air. Tracy was having trouble holding on the farther Aerodactyl went, when suddenly Crystal realized that Aerodactyl and Tracy were getting too far away, so she whistled to summon the two Farfetched, ordering them to follow after Tracy and Aerodactyl, so that they wouldn't lose them. Everyone else does chase after Tracy and Aerodactyl, but they just wanted to make sure that the Farfetch would chase as well, since they could get up closer. Meanwhile, as Tracy was on Aerodactyl, he begged Aerodactyl to fly lower, as he was scared of being up high, but this alerted Aerodactyl for the first time that Tracy was currently grabbing onto its leg, as it had no clue before, so this makes the Aerodactyl even angrier as it tries to shake him off, desperately thrashing extremely fast. Seeing this, everyone ordered Tracy to let go of Aerodactyl once there was a safe spot, as staying on Aerodactyl while it was angry probably wasn't a good idea. So, as Aerodactyl flies over a clearing of relatively soft grass, Aerodactyl happened to fly down a little bit toward the grass, so this gave Tracy the perfect time to jump down from an altitude that was still somewhat high up, but compared to how he was before, it wasn't that bad. So when he landed, although his ass hurt like absolute hell, he was still relatively uninjured. Everyone else then makes it to the clearing and goes to check on Tracy to make sure he was okay. Tracy confirms he was okay more or less, although he asks what they were going to do about the Aerodactyl, though everyone informs Tracy that the Farfetch had that covered. They were still on its trail. But suddenly, though, everyone was startled as they heard a bullet fire out of nowhere, and the next thing they know, they saw Butch and Cassidy's huge net that they had designed, which had come out of a net launcher, which was the sound of the bullet, and this net proceeded to knock Aerodactyl down to the ground and capture it inside. Everyone was shocked by this, as Gary questioned who the fuck would use such a daring and violent method, such as a trap net, to get a Pokemon, as opposed to a Pokeball, but he realized it was a stupid question when he remembered that Team Rocket would usually do something like this, and he wasn't surprised when Butch and Cassidy then revealed themselves and did their motto, stating their plan to capture Aerodactyl, and Gary recognized them in their Team Rocket outfits, even though he didn't actually know who they themselves were. Cassidy and Butch then taunted everyone, stating that the Aerodactyl was now theirs, but Gary refused to let this be true, as he wondered what he should do when he remembered that he had sometime, I don't know why Oak didn't mention this, but he had gotten back his Umbreon from Oak's lab, as opposed to just having his Blastoise now, as he realized that he might have needed it, I guess, and he sends out his Umbreon to battle Butch and Cassidy, while Butch and Cassidy send out their Hitmontop and Houndour respectively. Houndour then started off the battle by using Bite, but Umbreon simply dodged and tackled Houndour, knocking Houndour to the ground, and as it tried to get up, Umbreon hit it with a tackle for a second time. This led Hitmontop to go for a rolling kick, as Umbreon tries to tackle Hitmontop, but the rolling kick was too fast, so Umbreon had to jump out of the way to dodge, so the confrontation ended with neither Umbreon or Hitmontop being attacked. Seeing that Umbreon could use some help, Crystal revealed that she didn't just befriend Pokemon that she didn't own, she actually had trained a Pokemon herself, as she sent out an Ivysaur, assuring Gary that it was pretty strong, as she had Ivysaur tackle Houndour and use Vine Whip on Hitmontop, telling Butch and Cassidy that they would pay for messing with Aerodactyl, since she felt attached to it, since she had found the fossilized egg of Aerodactyl. With Houndour and Hitmontop now weakened, Gary has his Umbreon use Quick Attack to fully knock out both Houndour and Hitmontop at the same time, and then Crystal has her Ivysaur use Solar Beam to send Butch, Cassidy, Houndour, and Hitmontop up into the air, about to blast them off, but just then, much to everyone's shock, while still inside the net, Aerodactyl delivered the final blow to Butch and Cassidy, sending them truly blasting off with a Hyper Beam. However, the Hyper Beam also ended up breaking the net that was holding Aerodactyl, so now that it was free, it proceeded to fly away again, not knowing that everyone else would help it out and be its friend. So it basically flew away, and it started by going towards the ocean. But much to Gary and everyone else's relief, Aerodactyl turns around, with Gary suspecting that it didn't want to leave the island because it was afraid, because it was recently revived. And Oak agreed with this. Basically, the Aerodactyl didn't want to leave the island because it didn't know where else to go, since it was new to this world, and the island was all that it knew, so it didn't feel comfortable leaving. Oak also believed that Aerodactyl had to have been afraid of not just leaving the island, but just afraid of shit in general because it wasn't used to the world, reminding everyone how it was startled and scared when Tracy held its leg. Everyone then goes down and around the mountain to find where the Aerodactyl could have went off to, since the Farfetch'd had lost track of it since it was captured. And Tracy then questioned why such a powerful Pokemon would be scared of him holding its leg, leading Professor Oak to reply that a lot of Pokemon didn't realize how powerful they were, especially one that was just born and didn't know its limits. Tracy then realized that the whole situation with Butch and Cassidy could have made Aerodactyl even more scared of any humans, not knowing the difference between bad people like Butch and Cassidy and good people like them, so it took off in fear. So, everyone proceeded to curse Butch and Cassidy for being the reason why Aerodactyl didn't like them, but then Oak also realized that Tracy holding on to Aerodactyl's leg only made Aerodactyl not like humans even more either, so Butch and Cassidy weren't entirely at fault. Gary and Dora then got distracted as they talked about the Hyper Beam that blasted Butch and Cassidy off, impressed at the fact that it didn't come from Umbreon or Ivysaur since they couldn't learn the attacks. At first they kind of thought that it did, because they could barely even believe that Aerodactyl would have used an attack at all, but they came to the conclusion that it had to have been Aerodactyl using its special attack, Hyper Beam, knowing that Hyper Beam was Aerodactyl's special strongest attack because they had done so much research on Aerodactyl fossils and its past. Although Oak snapped Dora and Gary out of their little talk, though, stating that the Aerodactyl using Hyper Beam was the least of their worries right now, though, as they had to focus on getting the Aerodactyl back, and Oak suggested that in order to do this, they would have to show it that they didn't mean it any harm, further explaining that they had to calm it down and befriend it. In order to do this, Oak suggested that they either find something that made Aerodactyl happy, so that they could basically use it to convince it that they were its friend because they were giving it something that made it happy, and he also suggested that they find a potential weak spot that they could pinpoint, so that they could attack it if necessary, if they had to stop Aerodactyl from attacking them if it got angry at them. The thing that Oak didn't know was what Aerodactyl's weak spot was, or what they should do to make it happy. Gary didn't know what they should do to make it, or what they should do to target its weak spot or whatever, but Gary was confident that they wouldn't need to do that if they just gave it something that it truly liked, suggesting that they could feed it a food that it really liked. Although Oak questioned how they would find out what food that Aerodactyl liked, leading Dora to state that if they could do some genetic research on Aerodactyl, then they could find out its favorite food based on some of its genetics. And she tried to remember if they had some DNA that they could study, and she remembered that they did, as she recalled that there were still shards of Aerodactyl's egg lying around in the lab from when it hatched. And not only that, but she also remembers that they found some fossilized seeds near the egg that they had saved, so they could use the DNA from that and compare it to the DNA of the fossilized egg to find out what the favorite fruit of Aerodactyl was, or at least one that it liked, because the seeds wouldn't have been near the egg if it didn't like eating that fruit where the seeds came from. So they all returned to the lab to examine the DNA of the fossilized egg shards and the seeds. Gary eventually uses a machine to help compare the two DNA samples of the seeds of the fruit and the DNA of the egg shards, along with some of the DNA from the egg shards that they already had in their database, and upon comparing all of this DNA, the machine Gary was on suddenly looked up a berry known as an asperberry, indicating that that's the berry that the seeds were from. And sure enough, upon further examination of the DNA, which was why they needed to link it to Aerodactyl's DNA in the first place, they find that Aerodactyl had frequently ate this asperberry. To be sure that the DNA compare machine worked, Oak clarified with Gary that it did work, and Gary confirmed this, as he revealed, though, that he didn't know where to find asperberries, or if they even still grew on the island, because Aerodactyl may have just ate them millions of years ago when it was still active, and the berries might not have grown on the island anymore. But Crystal recognized the asperberry and confirmed that it did still grow on the island, as she led everyone to the tree that she knew the asperberries grew on. Well, a few of the trees, because Crystal declared that there were plenty others on the island apparently, and she then sends out her Ivysaur and has it use Vine Whip to take a few of the asperberries down and place them in her hands. Oak then suggested that Aerodactyl may even come to this tree to get the fruit soon, since it must have known that the fruit was still there, and it would be getting quite hungry after all the flying around. Sure enough, they all heard a loud familiar cry of Aerodactyl, so they quickly came up with an idea as they hid behind a nearby rock and spectated as they realized that the DNA comparing was right. The asperberries caught Aerodactyl's attention right away, and it really liked them, and it started to chow down on them, almost all the ones in the tree. Gary soon realizes that now that Aerodactyl was calmed down, eating all of the asperberries, now would be the perfect time for him to be the big man and feed Aerodactyl one of the berries that Ivysaur got down, and he grabs it from Crystal and was about to go out from the hiding place when suddenly Gary was stopped as he got startled by a helicopter approaching, driven by Butch and Cassidy, who had returned. Inside the helicopter, Butch and Cassidy were very happy to have found the Aerodactyl again, taunting that they were going to do everything in their power to take it. Everyone else tells Butch and Cassidy that that wouldn't be a good idea, as Aerodactyl was angry, but Butch and Cassidy didn't care, even though they should have, as Aerodactyl then flew up to the helicopter and started to attack it with several gusts, causing them to flip and turn around uncontrollably in their helicopter. But regardless, Butch and Cassidy survive and refuse to give up. Aerodactyl thought that it had dealt with Butch and Cassidy, though, so it simply flies away, not knowing that the helicopter was giving chase. Although, once Aerodactyl reached the ocean, it obviously didn't want to cross it, so it turned around to circle back. And it was then that it noticed the helicopter and tried to use a stronger form of gust, whirlwind, on the helicopter to truly take Butch and Cassidy down, with Butch admitting that it was getting hard to keep control of the helicopter now, and added that the whirlwind was making the helicopter uncontrollably slower. Obviously not wanting Aerodactyl to get away, Cassidy then pulls a lever inside the helicopter to launch a mechanical arm forward to grab hold of Aerodactyl, preventing it from flying off any farther. Crystal was angry at this, not wanting anything bad to happen to Aerodactyl, as she quickly came up with an idea, sending out her Ivysaur and telling it to use Razor Leaf, but the Razor Leaf failed, as it was no match for the helicopter's metal construction. Crystal knew that Ivysaur couldn't do anything, so she tried another way to help Aerodactyl, utilizing her talent of getting along with wild Pokemon, yelling for Aerodactyl to try its hardest to escape the mechanical hand, but Butch and Cassidy were too persistent to take Aerodactyl to Professor Namba, so they simply flew away at a super fast speed, which made it hard for Aerodactyl to even attempt to break free. So this led Gary to take action, as he sent out his Dodrio, surprising Oak that his Doduo had evolved. As Gary had also got back his Doduo from his lab as well at some point, but it was still a Doduo, so it must have recently evolved into a Dodrio, like very recent. Gary then has his Dodrio use its long and powerful legs to jump all the way up to the helicopter, startling Butch and Cassidy, as they nearly lose their grip on Aerodactyl at the sight of Dodrio at their front window, since Cassidy had to keep the lever extended to not lose the grip on Aerodactyl. And then Dodrio uses a fury of drill pecks on the helicopter, which ended up being too much for both Butch and Cassidy and the helicopter, as the window shattered, causing Butch and Cassidy to get injured by the shattered glass. And to make matters worse for the helicopter, even though it was already heavily damaged, Dodrio managed to poke a hole in the helicopter's gas tank, releasing all the gas, which caused the helicopter to start on fire and explode, blasting Butch and Cassidy off, also forcing Butch and Cassidy to release the lever, freeing Aerodactyl from the hand. And even though Butch and Cassidy were already going blasting off, Aerodactyl used a Hyper Beam to send them blasting off even further. Hopefully that meant they'd stay gone for quite a while. Everyone was immensely pleased, especially Crystal and Gary, who were pleased with their Pokemon's performances, with Gary saying his Dojo did great, and Crystal saying her Ivysaur did great. And everyone was even more happy, as they assumed that Aerodactyl would now be fond of them, since it should have recognized that they helped defeat Butch and Cassidy and rescued it. But apparently, Aerodactyl thought that everyone had only rescued it so that they could capture it instead. So Aerodactyl flew off. Oak realized that they would still have to get Aerodactyl to trust them, but was confident they could do this if they just went back to their original plan of feeding an Asperberry to Aerodactyl, as Oak saw that Aerodactyl was flying back to the Asperberry tree. So they all returned there and hid behind the rock once again, with Gary preparing to go out and approach Aerodactyl with the Asperberry. So Gary waited for Aerodactyl to start eating an Asperberry again when it got to the tree, and sure enough, it started to eat. So Gary snuck up with the Asperberry, with everyone else following, including their Pokemon that were out, such as Umbreon, Dodrio, Ivysaur, and even the Farfetch from earlier. Aerodactyl soon notices everyone and gets startled as it stands its ground, angrily roaring at them. But Gary was confident he could convince Aerodactyl that he wanted to be its friend, since he had that Asperberry in his hands that was very ripe, and Aerodactyl would like it very much. So he took the opportunity to go, along with Crystal, who wanted to come as well, along with Umbreon, Farfetch, Dodrio, and Ivysaur, to go up to Aerodactyl, and they tried to assure Aerodactyl that they were on its side and wanted to be its friend. Gary then realized that in order to calm the Aerodactyl down, he may have to make it believe that he did care for any Pokemon, so he pet his Umbreon and stated that he cared for any Pokemon, as Dodrio, Ivysaur, and the Farfetch all said something in Pokemon language to confirm this fact. And Gary then added that he trusted and cared for all of his Pokemon, and they trusted and cared for him, so Aerodactyl should do the same, assuring Aerodactyl that it really wanted to be its friend. Aerodactyl stopped and stared at Gary for a few seconds to consider what he just said, though it stands its ground again, angrily roaring. Although Aerodactyl was too hungry to stand guard for long, so it simply turned around back to the Asperberry tree and began eating the Asperberries again, giving a loud roar of delight this time, happy to be eating the Asperberries. Seeing how Aerodactyl was distracted, Gary thought it was the perfect time for him to offer the Asperberry to Aerodactyl kindly, though Oak didn't think that it would be a great idea anymore, warning Gary that this could be a risky move, as Aerodactyl could angrily respond at any moment. But Gary told Oak that he knew what he was doing, as he takes the Asperberry out of his pocket and calls out for Aerodactyl's attention, coming up to him with the Asperberry. Aerodactyl gives him an odd look for a few seconds and was scared, thinking that maybe Gary was trying to poison it by giving it a fake Asperberry or something, so it sniffed it to make sure it wasn't a trap, as everyone else watched in anticipation. But after Gary assured it one more time that the Asperberry wasn't poisonous, Gary managed to get the Aerodactyl to gulp the fruit down in a couple bites in pleasure, very happy now. Everyone then cheered, congratulating Gary, because now the Aerodactyl was so happy it became friendly towards them. And since it was super friendly, Crystal thought that she had no risk of going up to it by herself and wanted to try feeding it as well. So she grabs some of the other Asperberries that Ivysaur had pulled down and puts them into a basket that she somehow had with her. And sure enough, Aerodactyl swooped down to her, seeing this basket of Asperberries, and it was very happy to eat them, eating one whole Asperberry per bite. Aerodactyl then began to play with Crystal, flying around and playfully threatening to scoop her up, even though it didn't. And Gary and Dora then declared that Aerodactyl had now trusted everyone to the point where it had apparently agreed to spend some time with them on the island and help them with their studies, as Gary had requested it to. So now Gary could learn more about prehistoric Pokemon. Everyone then returns to the dock by the boat that was driven by Jared, as Tracy and Oak were going to now return to Pallet Town with the issue of Aerodactyl being settled. At the dock, Gary, Dora, and Crystal thank Oak and Tracy and Jared for all their help, and they agree to let Oak in on their studies of Aerodactyl, since Oak was extremely interested in Aerodactyl as much as them. Gary then expresses to Oak that he had a desire to one day revive an Ammonite, or Kabuto, so that he could do more research on other extinct Pokemon aside from Aerodactyl. And Dora stated that Gary would definitely have the chance to do this, since he was officially being offered a full-on job as a head researcher alongside her at the lab, as he was more just kind of like a newbie guy, but now he was getting a full-on job. Oak congratulated Tracy on this, and assured Gary that he knew that he would do good in his research on prehistoric Pokemon, stating that he knew that whatever his grandson would do, he would do it well. Crystal then comes by and asks if Oak would return to the island one day, really hoping that he would, since she still looked up to him, and Oak assured Crystal that he would return one day, and then Tracy decided to give Crystal a parting gift, which was a rolled up piece of paper. However, when Crystal unrolled it, she found that it was actually a personal, very detailed sketch of her Ivysaur, drawn by Tracy himself, which Crystal loved and thanked Tracy immensely for. Professor Oak and Tracy then get on the boat with Jared, as Jared starts it up, and Professor Oak tells Crystal to look after Aerodactyl, and Crystal promised that she would, and compliments Oak, calling him the coolest professor ever. And with that, Oak and Tracy set off, saying their goodbyes and thanks to Gary, Crystal, Dora, and Gary, Crystal, and Dora say goodbye as well, and express their thanks as well. The episode then ends as Jared drives Oak and Tracy on his boat back to Pallet Town, and while they were all crossing the ocean, Tracy pointed out the same lappers that Crystal had befriended, and they admired them for quite a while. Then, Tracy declared to Oak that his grandson Gary would be a great Pokemon researcher and tackle many interesting subjects one day, but Professor Oak corrects Tracy, stating that Gary was already a great Pokemon researcher who was going to tackle many interesting subjects, including that of prehistoric Pokemon. And we then see one last shot of the island, and the boat driving alongside the School of Lapras.